Hi, welcome to this new episode of Lutra TV. I'm Ivan and I'm here with Amanda today and we'll be talking about desktop studies. So Amanda, what is actually a desktop study?
So a desktop study is essentially any sort of initial screening or feasibility kind of level of a study where we just use data that we can collect remotely from a site without having to visit the site and collect the data ourselves.
Yeah. So what kind of data sources are we talking about?
Oh, literally dozens of different sources, SCADA data that we can get from ID, say, which will give us a lot of information about the actual performance of the plant. We can get things like site layouts, GIS data from councils, images from Google Maps and Google Earth. We can get consent data, we can get data from the local regional councils about water quality and the list goes on. So once you've got all this data, what do you do with it? Have you worked on any interesting desktop studies?
I've actually done one recently for a site in Australia where, well, obviously we're in New Zealand, so it's not really easy for us to come and visit. So we got SCADA data, lab data, previous reports that they've done, historical records, and from that data we could actually identify pretty quickly a few opportunities for improvement. And that's just, I think a lot of councils and treatment plants, they have all the data, but it's scattered. Even in SCADA systems, it's very hard to overlay trends that you want. So for us, especially if we would use a platform like ID, it's very easy for us to combine all that data and actually extract meaningful results out of those. So in case of that specific project, we found 3 improvement opportunities and they're going to implement all 3 of them.
Oh,
and not only at the plant that we investigated, but actually other plants who were facing similar challenges. So Amanda, do you have any good examples of some desktop studies that you've done?
So I've worked on desktop studies that have covered a few different areas. The most common ones that we do are around some planning and scoping and feasibility. So we might do some high-level master planning, for example, where we'll take a whole lot of data about a plant, we'll take existing reports, we'll take demand figures, population growth models, site layouts, and we'll determine things like whether that plant has enough capacity to be able to continue to supply drinking water to the population going forward 10, 20, 30 years, or if the council may have to start putting plans in place to expand the capacity of that plant or look at alternative sources so they can complement the supply. We might also do desktop studies for things like risk assessments or multi-criteria analysis, where we'll do a first pass as a desktop study using the data that we have available and then take that forward to then work with a client to continue to populate it and add more detail that might be about things that we don't know because we don't have that data available.
Yeah. What would you think is an advantage of a desktop study? Why would we want to do this?
Well, I think one of the main ones that you touched on was it's fast and it's a lot cheaper because we don't have to physically travel to the site and collect information ourselves. That would be the main advantage, is that you can get things done usually at a higher level quite quickly, especially when you want to go into further detail that you may need to visit a site or request additional data that you don't have readily available. I think one of the, disadvantages of doing a desktop study is that, like as you mentioned, you're relying on the data that you gather, but the outcomes of your study are only going to be as good as the quality of the data that you got.
Exactly. I think I agree, and especially I see desktop studies as a great tool to kind of, in a quite a cost-effective way, determine priorities of what you want to address first.
So I guess if you want to look more specifically about, real-life problems that we've been able to solve using a desktop study, we had one client a few years ago that was having problems with sand entrainment coming out of a bore field. And rather than having to go to each individual bore and take bore samples to try and determine the relative quantities of solids coming out of each one, we were able to go back and look at the SCADA data through ID and through analysing flow rates, turbidity, pressure profiles, and we were able to identify which one of those bores was going to be likely the problem, and sort of highlighting that one for rehabilitation. So that was, I think, a really good outcome for that client without having to do a lot of site work.
Yeah, I think I've got a similar example from a few days ago, actually, where a client actually contacted me and was like, hey, we see these stability spikes come every day at the same time, and for the past 5 years we have not been able to figure out what's causing this. Do you have any ideas? So yeah, in ID we get a lot of data, and I could actually link back those stability spikes with the flushing of the lime system. So it's kind of like these things, like the data is there, it's just connecting it and actually making sense of what is there. I think the other one is, for the Australian side, we actually looked into the performance, which was, I mean, the plant was doing fine, but there's always room for improvement. So sometimes they would get a lot of operator call-outs, especially when the weather wasn't doing too great. And it turned out that they were not controlling their pH properly. So it's just those easy things. Put in some better pH control, and then also better coagulant control, and most likely a lot of these issues will go away.
So I guess it's really the conclusion I guess I would take from that is to say, yeah, we can have all this data and we can measure all these things, but it's adding that layer of, I guess, knowledge and understanding over the top to know what data goes together and what could influence each other in terms of that process engineering application.
Yeah. So what are some things to keep in mind in terms of data and information if people want to do a desktop study?
I think there's a few things that you need to look out for. So one of the main data sources that we often look at is water quality data. That can provide us a lot of information, but it can also have a lot of gaps and raise a few challenges. I think, for example, things like if you have sampled from a bore, we don't necessarily know whether that bore was running when the sample was taken. You might have a sample that's got an unusually high iron content, and we don't know whether that's an average for that bore or whether the bore wasn't flushed before the sample was taken. It's a random spike, which won't then tell us what the average water going through a plant is, but it might be really useful information to know at bore startup, for example. Similarly, if you've got a surface water source and we just have a random sample, we don't know when that was taken, we don't know what the weather was like, we don't know what the impact of weather and temperature and season might be on that water quality. So I think that's something to be mindful of when you're doing it.
I think the few things that I've seen is sometimes we look at data from a long time ago, and there have been changes at the plant that we don't know of or that we didn't realize. So sometimes we're looking at old data that is pretty much not relevant anymore. The other thing that I've seen as well is information that's being kept by operators or are not written down or communicated somewhere. So
things that are just from experience.
Yeah. So sometimes, I mean, it happens, equipment fails like an instrument and they know it, but we look at the data and we think like, oh, there's something weird going on here. Oh, no, that instrument has been failing for a long time. So yeah, I guess the desktop study is only as good as the data. And yeah, it requires a lot of information, including anecdotal information, to kind of paint the whole picture. And I guess with that, desktop studies, I think they're really good on a high level. Obviously, if we start to dig down, that's where it gets quite difficult and tricky. So yeah, I think it's a very good tool to quickly see what are my main opportunities and where should I focus on.
One of the things that I'll often do if I'm working on a desktop study is, once we've done the bulk of it, to go and present it to the client, talk it through, discuss some of the assumptions that we've made and just verify that everything that we've said or that we've assumed is actually correct. Yeah. Right, well, thanks for the chat, Ivan. It was really interesting to talk about desktop studies. So as you can see, they can be a really great stepping stone towards optimizing a plant, finding issues, doing feasibility studies, and carrying out activities for future planning. And we do them using just the data that we've already collected. If you want to know more about how Loojer can help you with a desktop study or any other kind of process engineering problem, just get in touch.